June 1944. Atlantic coast of occupied France. For 12 in the morning. Night still clung to the shoreline, heavy and damp, pressing low over rows of concrete bunkers carved into the cliffs. The tide moved slowly beneath a moonless sky, dragging foam across steel obstacles planted in the sand. German sentries watched the horizon through narrow embrasures, their silhouettes motionless against cold walls of reinforced cement. For months, the ocean had been their enemy, silent, patient, expected. The air smelled of salt, oil, and wet stone. Then came a sound no one could locate. At first, it resembled distant thunder beyond the clouds. A low vibration, almost imagined, passing through the bunker floors before reaching the ears. The soldiers paused, listening. The sky above remained empty, dark, indifferent. The sound grew. Not sharp like artillery, not brief like aircraft patrols. It deepened into a continuous mechanical pulse, steady, enormous, multiplying. The horizon itself seemed to hum. Within minutes, the men guarding Hitler's Atlantic Wall understood something unsettling. The attack was not coming from the sea. It was coming from the sky, and it was far larger than anything their defenses had been built to stop. In the summer of 1940, Europe appeared settled under a new order. France had fallen in 6 weeks. British forces had withdrawn across the Channel at Dunkirk, leaving behind equipment scattered along the beaches. German armored divisions stood victorious from the Ardennes to the Atlantic coast, and for the first time in modern history, the entire western shoreline of continental Europe rested under the control of a single power. To many within the German command structure, the war in the West seemed effectively decided. The coastline itself became both prize and shield. Stretching from northern Norway to the Spanish border, thousands of kilometers of cliffs, harbors, dunes, and tidal flats formed what Adolf Hitler imagined as an impenetrable frontier, a barrier that would prevent any Allied return to mainland Europe. This vision would become known as the Atlantic Wall, a vast defensive system intended not merely to delay invasion but to make it impossible. Construction began gradually in 1941 and accelerated dramatically after the United States entered the war in December of that year. Responsibility fell largely to Organisation Todt, the massive German engineering body already experienced in building highways and fortifications. Millions of tons of concrete were poured into bunkers, artillery casemates, observation towers, radar stations, and underground ammunition depots. Forced laborers from occupied nations worked beside German engineers, carving defensive positions directly into rock and sand. The philosophy behind the Atlantic Wall reflected lessons drawn from earlier conflicts. German planners believed that an invading army must arrive by sea in concentrated formations. Ships would approach beaches slowly, exposed to artillery fire. Coastal guns, properly positioned and protected by reinforced concrete, could destroy transports before troops ever reached land. Minefields and steel obstacles would finish what artillery began. In theory, the invasion would collapse before infantry set foot on European soil. Heavy batteries guarded key sectors. Some guns were naval weapons repurposed from warships, capable of firing shells weighing hundreds of kilograms across vast distances. Observation posts directed fire through carefully calculated coordinates. Interlocking machine gun positions ensured that beaches became overlapping zones of lethal crossfire. Every bunker was designed to survive bombardment, its thick concrete angled to deflect explosions. To the soldiers stationed there, the defenses felt permanent. Many units assigned to coastal duty were not elite formations but reserve divisions, older soldiers, recovering wounded, or troops transferred from quieter fronts. Their daily routine revolved around maintenance, drills, and long hours of watching empty horizons. The war, for them, existed elsewhere, in Russia's vast plains or in the skies over German cities. Yet strategic anxiety persisted at higher levels of command. Britain had not surrendered. Across the Channel, Allied forces rebuilt steadily. Intelligence reports described growing American troop arrivals, expanding airfields, and increasing naval construction. Still, German leadership believed geography favored defense. The English Channel remained a natural moat, unpredictable and dangerous. Any invasion fleet would require enormous preparation, and such preparation, commanders assumed, could not be hidden. By 1942, Hitler ordered the fortifications expanded dramatically. Concrete thickness increased. Beach obstacles multiplied. Entire coastal villages were reshaped to accommodate gun positions. Propaganda portrayed the Atlantic Wall as invincible, a technological masterpiece capable of crushing any attempt at liberation. Newspapers described it as a fortress stretching across Europe, guarded by disciplined soldiers and modern weapons. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, appointed Commander-in-Chief West, oversaw large portions of the defense network. His strategy emphasized holding strong positions inland while allowing mobile reserves to counterattack once an invasion revealed its true landing site. Others disagreed. Later, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, fresh from North Africa, inspected the coast and concluded that modern warfare had changed. Air power, he warned, would dominate any future battle. If Allied aircraft controlled the skies, German reinforcements might never reach the beaches in time. Rommel's inspections revealed troubling realities. Many bunkers were incomplete. Some artillery lacked adequate protection. Troops were dispersed across wide sectors. Most concerning was the increasing presence of Allied reconnaissance aircraft overhead. Nearly every day, high-altitude planes crossed the coast photographing defenses with apparent impunity. German fighters attempted interception, but fuel shortages and mounting losses limited effectiveness. Despite these warnings, confidence remained rooted in past experience. Germany's early victories had been achieved through speed, surprise, and decisive ground operations. Static defenses supported maneuver warfare but were rarely tested against overwhelming aerial assault. Many commanders still believed bombs alone could not destroy reinforced concrete positions designed specifically to resist bombardment. Life along the coast settled into repetition. Soldiers repaired barbed wire, calibrated rangefinders, and listened to distant radio broadcasts describing battles far away. The ocean remained their primary focus. Training manuals emphasized identifying landing craft silhouettes, estimating naval distances, and coordinating artillery fire against ships. Above them, however, a different war was beginning to take shape. One measured not in divisions crossing borders but in factories producing aircraft at a scale never before seen. Across the Atlantic Ocean, American industry was transforming mobilization into mass production, reshaping the balance of power in ways few coastal defenders yet understood. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to stop an army arriving by water. Its creators assumed the decisive battle would begin at sea level, where guns and obstacles held advantage. But by late 1943, the true battlefield was already shifting upward, into the airspace over Europe, where distance, industry, and technology would challenge the very concept of fixed defense. The skies over Western Europe slowly filled with aircraft formations growing larger each month. Early missions suffered heavy losses. German fighter defenses and anti-aircraft guns proved deadly, particularly before long-range escort fighters were available. Raids over heavily defended cities demonstrated the vulnerability of bombers operating alone. Yet instead of abandoning the doctrine, American command expanded it, improving tactics, increasing formation sizes, and integrating new technologies. Radar navigation improved bombing accuracy. Electronic countermeasures disrupted German detection systems. Most importantly, the arrival of long-range escort fighters, especially the North American P-51 Mustang, allowed bombers protection deep into occupied territory. Gradually, the balance in the air shifted. By late 1943, Allied air forces pursued a coordinated strategy known as the Combined Bomber Offensive. British bombers struck at night, while American formations attacked during daylight, maintaining near-constant pressure on German industry and infrastructure. Factories producing aircraft, synthetic fuel plants, rail junctions, and submarine bases became recurring targets. The goal was not a single decisive raid, but cumulative exhaustion. German commanders began noticing a troubling pattern. Each intercepted formation seemed larger than the last. Losses inflicted one week appeared replaced the next by even greater numbers. Intelligence reports struggled to estimate American production capacity accurately. Figures often seemed exaggerated, yet reality repeatedly surpassed expectations. Along the Atlantic coast, this transformation initially felt distant. Coastal garrisons heard reports of bombing raids inland but rarely experienced sustained attacks themselves. Their bunkers faced outward toward the sea, designed to repel ships, not aircraft formations numbering in the hundreds. Anti-aircraft guns existed, but many were positioned to defend ports and major cities rather than isolated defensive sectors. Meanwhile, Allied planners prepared for an invasion that depended entirely on air superiority. Before soldiers could land, transportation networks behind the coast had to be disrupted. Reinforcements needed to be delayed. Artillery positions had to be weakened or blinded. The Atlantic Wall did not need to be completely destroyed, only isolated and disorganized at the moment of invasion. Air power became the tool to achieve this. In early 1944, Allied bombing priorities shifted noticeably toward northern France and Belgium. Rail yards, bridges, communication hubs, and radar stations along the Channel coast came under increasing attack. To German observers, the pattern appeared confusing. Bombing seemed scattered, sometimes striking small towns or secondary infrastructure rather than obvious military targets. Yet the cumulative effect slowly reduced mobility across the region. Field Marshal Rommel grew increasingly alarmed during inspections. He observed craters disrupting transport routes and noted how Allied aircraft operated almost freely during daylight hours. He concluded that once an invasion began, German armored divisions might struggle to move under constant aerial attack. The decisive battle, he warned, would be decided within the first hours, before reinforcements could arrive. Still, many officers believed fortified concrete would endure. Bunkers several meters thick had survived previous bombardments. Coastal artillery remained operational. Radar stations continued scanning the sea. The assumption persisted that air attacks alone could not dismantle a defensive system built explicitly to resist shelling. Yet the nature of bombardment was changing. Instead of isolated strikes, Allied planners envisioned synchronized waves of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of aircraft striking simultaneously across wide sectors. Precision was less important than saturation. Shock, disruption, and paralysis would achieve what direct destruction might not. The defining element of this new warfare was not merely explosive power but repetition. Day after day, formations crossed the Channel. Engines became a constant presence, a mechanical horizon replacing silence. Soldiers who once measured time by tides began measuring it by the distant approach of aircraft. The sound arrived first, low, steady, impossible to ignore. It rolled across the coastline long before planes became visible, vibrating through concrete and sand alike. To defenders trained to watch the sea, the sky increasingly demanded attention. By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic Wall still stood physically intact, but its strategic foundation was already eroding. The defenders remained armed and prepared, yet the environment around them had changed. Supply routes weakened. Communications faltered. Confidence slowly gave way to uncertainty. And soon, the growing sound overhead would transform from distant warning into overwhelming reality, forcing German soldiers to confront a form of warfare their defenses had never truly been designed to resist. The transformation of the Atlantic coast cannot be understood through strategy alone. It unfolded through overlapping perspectives, human, technological, and industrial, each revealing a different dimension of the same approaching storm. What German soldiers experienced was not simply bombardment, but the collision between two fundamentally different visions of modern war. The first angle was human expectation. For the average German soldier stationed along the French coastline, duty felt predictable. Many units assigned to coastal defense were categorized as static divisions, formations considered unsuitable for fast offensive operations. Some soldiers were veterans recovering from wounds sustained on the Eastern Front. Others were older reservists or very young recruits completing training assignments. Compared to Russia's brutal front lines, coastal duty appeared almost safe. Daily life followed repetition. Equipment inspections at dawn. Patrols along barbed wire obstacles. Observation shifts staring across empty water. Training emphasized identifying silhouettes of landing craft and coordinating artillery fire against naval targets. The enemy, they believed, would appear slowly and visibly, emerging from the horizon in ships that could be measured, tracked, and destroyed. This expectation shaped psychology. The ocean represented danger, the sky represented routine. Aircraft passed frequently, but for long periods they remained reconnaissance flights or distant formations traveling inland. Bombing raids against coastal defenses were occasional rather than constant. Soldiers learned to distinguish sounds, fighters produced sharp, brief roars, isolated bombers came and went quickly. Air activity became background noise rather than existential threat. Then formations began to grow. Reports described entire horizons filled with aircraft flying in rigid patterns. The sound differed from anything familiar, not individual engines but a continuous mechanical presence. Soldiers later recorded in letters and reports that the sky itself seemed alive, vibrating before bombs ever fell. One German coastal artillery officer noted that the psychological impact began minutes before visual contact, as the sound erased normal battlefield anticipation. Instead of sudden attack, dread accumulated gradually. Expectation collapsed into confusion. Defenses oriented outward could not easily respond upward. Inside bunkers, soldiers felt protected from naval shells yet strangely exposed to unseen forces above reinforced ceilings. The carefully constructed certainty of defensive doctrine began to fracture. The second angle was technological confrontation. German coastal defenses represented engineering excellence of an earlier phase of warfare. Reinforced concrete casemates were designed to resist naval artillery trajectories, horizontal impacts arriving from long distances. Walls angled toward the sea maximized protection against shells striking laterally. Observation slits remained narrow to reduce vulnerability. Strategic bombing challenged these assumptions entirely. High-altitude bombers attacked vertically, dropping explosives designed to penetrate before detonating. Even when bunkers survived structurally, surrounding infrastructure suffered. Communication lines snapped. Ammunition storage areas exploded. Radar installations, often more fragile than gun emplacements, became priority targets. Without radar coordination, defensive guns lost early warning capabilities. Anti-aircraft systems attempted response. Germany possessed formidable flak networks, including the famous 88mm guns capable of reaching high altitudes. Yet coastal sectors lacked the dense concentration protecting major cities like Berlin or Hamburg. Ammunition supplies were limited, and sustained engagements against hundreds of aircraft strained logistics quickly. Bomber formations themselves represented technological adaptation. Flying in tight defensive boxes, B-17 and B-24 aircraft created overlapping machine gun coverage that discouraged fighter interception. Even when damaged, many aircraft continued flying, reinforcing the perception of resilience. German reports frequently described bombers absorbing heavy damage while maintaining formation, a psychological shock for defenders accustomed to aircraft vulnerability. Technology alone did not decide outcomes. Scale amplified its effect. This leads to the third angle, industrial power. Germany's war economy, though formidable, struggled under resource constraints, labor shortages, and increasing Allied bombing. Replacement aircraft, spare parts, and fuel became progressively scarce. Coastal defenses depended on steady supply chains vulnerable to disruption. The United States, by contrast, transformed industrial capacity into strategic weaponry. American factories produced aircraft faster than losses could diminish operational strength. New bomber groups arrived continuously in Britain, replacing casualties and expanding operational reach simultaneously. German intelligence officers repeatedly underestimated production figures because traditional military logic struggled to comprehend such output. For coastal soldiers, this disparity manifested as repetition without relief. Bombers returned again and again. Damage repaired one week faced renewed attack the next. The sense of fighting a finite enemy disappeared, replaced by confrontation with something seemingly inexhaustible. Official German reports increasingly referenced the same observation: the enemy possessed unlimited material superiority. The phrase appeared not as propaganda but as reluctant acknowledgement. Defensive planning assumed attrition would weaken attackers. Instead, attrition appeared to strengthen them. Thus three realities converged along the Atlantic coast. Human expectations built around naval invasion, technological defenses designed for horizontal warfare, and industrial calculations rooted in earlier conflicts all collided with a new form of combat defined by altitude, repetition, and overwhelming production. And as these pressures intensified, another dimension emerged: leadership decisions, psychological strain, and opposing perspectives that would determine whether the Atlantic Wall could adapt before the decisive moment arrived. As the bombing campaign intensified, the experience along the Atlantic coast expanded beyond immediate destruction. Leadership disagreements, psychological erosion, and the perspective of the attackers themselves revealed how deeply the balance of war had shifted. The Atlantic Wall was no longer only a physical structure. It had become a test of competing military philosophies. The fourth angle was leadership and doctrine. German command in Western Europe faced a strategic dilemma that remained unresolved even as Allied air power grew stronger. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt believed in defense through maneuver. His experience suggested that fixed fortifications could delay an enemy, but victory required mobile armored reserves positioned inland, ready to strike once the invasion's main landing site became clear. Flexibility, not rigidity, had defined Germany's earlier successes. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reached a different conclusion after inspecting the coast in late 1943 and early 1944. Having witnessed Allied air superiority in North Africa, he understood how aircraft could paralyze movement. Roads exposed to constant aerial surveillance became death traps for convoys. Rommel argued that any invasion must be defeated directly on the beaches, within the first hours, before Allied air forces isolated the battlefield entirely. This disagreement created operational uncertainty. Armored divisions were divided between inland reserve and coastal proximity. Command authority required approval from Adolf Hitler himself for large-scale movement, introducing delays into decision-making. Meanwhile, Allied bombers systematically targeted transportation networks, rail lines, bridges, fuel depots, ensuring that whichever strategy proved correct, German forces would struggle to execute it under bombardment. Rommel's reports grew increasingly urgent. He described Allied aircraft dominating daylight hours and warned that German soldiers were fighting an enemy who controlled not just terrain but time itself. Movement during the day became dangerous. Logistics shifted to nighttime operations. The battlefield rhythm changed, favoring the side that owned the sky. The fifth angle was psychological transformation. Before heavy bombardment began, many coastal soldiers believed the Atlantic Wall represented safety. Concrete thickness, heavy guns, and engineered obstacles gave physical reassurance. Yet repeated bombing introduced a new form of stress distinct from traditional combat. Bombers announced their arrival long before impact. The growing drone of engines created anticipation without immediate action. Minutes stretched while soldiers waited underground, unable to fight back effectively. Unlike artillery duels or infantry combat, there was no visible opponent, no clear moment of engagement. Survival depended on endurance rather than skill. German medical reports later described increased fatigue and anxiety among coastal units exposed to sustained air raids. Sleep patterns fractured. Repairs carried out during the day risked renewed attack. Even when bombs missed their targets, shockwaves shook bunkers relentlessly, reinforcing a sense of vulnerability. Letters sent home frequently mentioned the sound. Soldiers described it as endless, mechanical, almost impersonal, war conducted by machines rather than men. The psychological effect extended beyond casualties. Confidence in defensive permanence weakened as each raid demonstrated that no position was beyond reach. Propaganda continued portraying the Atlantic Wall as invincible, yet those stationed within it witnessed gradual degradation. Damaged communication cables, disrupted supply deliveries, and command posts forced to relocate repeatedly. The wall still existed, but its certainty faded. The sixth angle emerged from the opposing side, the perspective of the American bomber crews. For the airmen departing English airfields, missions over occupied Europe carried extreme risk. Flying at high altitude exposed crews to freezing temperatures, oxygen deprivation, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Casualty rates during earlier bombing campaigns had been severe enough that completing a full tour of missions became statistically uncertain. Formation flying demanded discipline. Individual survival depended on collective cohesion. Bomber crews operated within a structured routine. Briefings before dawn identified targets using reconnaissance photography. Crews memorized routes, flak zones, and rendezvous points with escort fighters. Once airborne, formations assembled into vast aerial armadas stretching across miles of sky. From above, the Atlantic coast appeared ordered and geometric. Bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions arranged with calculated precision. Yet bombing at altitude remained imperfect. Even precise formations produced wide dispersal patterns. The objective was not surgical destruction but overwhelming pressure. Craters disrupting movement, explosions severing communications, shock disorganizing defenders. American mission reports emphasized repetition. Targets struck once would be attacked again to prevent repair. The strategy relied less on a single decisive blow and more on cumulative exhaustion. Each sortie added strain until defensive systems ceased functioning cohesively. Bomber crews also experienced the symbolic dimension of their presence. The sound produced by hundreds of synchronized engines became both reassurance and burden. Within formations, the noise represented safety, proof that they were not alone. For those on the ground, it signaled inevitability. Thus, two psychological worlds developed simultaneously. In the air, crews believed they were opening the path for liberation through persistence and industrial strength. On the ground, defenders confronted an adversary that seemed immune to traditional limits of loss or distance. By the spring of 1944, leadership disagreements, mounting psychological pressure, and relentless aerial operations converged toward a single conclusion. The decisive confrontation would not begin with ships appearing on the horizon, but with the sky itself transforming into a battlefield. And soon, that transformation would reach its peak, when the bombing shifted from preparation to overwhelming assault, the moment when the Atlantic Wall would face the full weight of Allied air power at once. Spring 1944 marked a quiet but decisive escalation along the Channel coast. The change did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated through patterns that only later revealed their purpose. Bombing raids increased in frequency, then in scale, then in coordination. What had once been intermittent attacks became sustained operational pressure, synchronized across airfields, fleets, and intelligence networks preparing for a single objective. In April, Allied planners initiated what became known as the Transportation Plan, a systematic effort to isolate northern France before invasion. Rail yards linking coastal regions to the interior were struck repeatedly. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Locomotive depots burned for days after impact. German repair crews worked continuously, yet each reconstruction drew renewed bombardment. Movement slowed, then stalled. Reinforcements that once could travel quickly now required complex détours vulnerable to further attack. Along the Atlantic Wall, soldiers noticed the change not through announcements but through rhythm. The drone of engines arrived earlier each morning and lingered longer into the afternoon. Formations appeared in layers, reconnaissance aircraft first, followed by escort fighters sweeping ahead, then the bombers themselves, long, disciplined streams crossing the channel in precise alignment. On several days in May 1944, hundreds of heavy bombers approached simultaneously, their contrails forming pale lines across the upper atmosphere. German radar detected them early, but warning brought little relief. Coastal anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, sending black bursts into the sky, yet the formations continued forward with mechanical steadiness. Losses occurred, but gaps closed quickly as aircraft maintained position. The targets now shifted closer to invasion zones. Coastal artillery batteries, radar stations, communication centers, and defensive strongpoints came under concentrated attack. Bombs weighing hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilograms fell in dense patterns intended to overwhelm rather than precisely destroy. Even when bunkers survived direct hits, surrounding terrain transformed into shattered ground, complicating movement and coordination. German reports recorded the sensory experience with unusual consistency. Observers described daylight fading beneath aircraft shadows. The sound became continuous, not waves of attack but an unbroken presence lasting hours. Inside bunkers, vibration traveled through reinforced concrete, shaking dust from ceilings and rattling equipment mounted securely only days earlier. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to resist impact from predictable directions. Naval artillery fired horizontally, infantry attacked from defined fronts. Strategic bombing erased those assumptions. Explosions arrived from above and behind, striking communication trenches, supply points, and observation posts essential for coordinated defense. Telephone lines snapped repeatedly. Radio transmissions struggled against interference and damage. Rommel's earlier warnings began to materialize visibly. Units attempting to reposition during daylight faced strafing from Allied fighters accompanying bomber formations. Vehicles abandoned roads to hide beneath trees or camouflage nets, slowing response times dramatically. Commanders discovered that issuing orders mattered less when transportation itself became hazardous. One particularly revealing pattern emerged: repeated attacks against radar installations. These systems provided early detection of approaching fleets and aircraft, forming the nervous system of coastal defense. Bombing raids disabled several stations temporarily. Repair crews restored them only to face renewed destruction days later. Gradually, detection coverage weakened, shortening warning times for incoming formations. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence refined targeting through aerial photography analyzed with growing precision. Each mission incorporated updated imagery showing damage, repairs, and surviving structures. Bombing evolved into iterative pressure, learning from previous strikes and returning with adjusted aim points. German soldiers increasingly realized that bombardment served a larger purpose. The attacks were not random punishment but preparation. Yet uncertainty persisted regarding timing and location. Normandy, Pas-de-Calais, and other sectors all experienced raids, reinforcing Allied deception efforts that obscured the true invasion site. The psychological effect intensified. Waiting replaced action. Soldiers endured bombardment without the ability to retaliate meaningfully. Even successful flak engagements offered little reassurance, as new formations followed hours later. The sense of confronting an endless enemy deepened. By late May, aerial activity reached unprecedented levels. Massive formations assembled over England daily, sometimes visible even from the French coast before crossing the Channel. Fuel dumps ignited under repeated attack, sending smoke columns visible for kilometers. Supply shortages began appearing in localized sectors as transportation disruptions compounded. The recurring sound of engines became the defining feature of coastal life. Conversations paused when the vibration began. Meals stopped unfinished. Men instinctively moved toward shelter before alarms fully sounded. The sky dictated routine more than command schedules. Yet the most decisive phase had not yet begun. Allied planners intended a final overwhelming bombardment designed not merely to weaken defenses but to disorient them completely. A coordinated assault that would strike immediately before invasion forces crossed the sea. When that moment arrived, the Atlantic Wall would face the largest concentration of air power yet assembled, and German soldiers would witness a scale of destruction that shattered remaining assumptions about the limits of aerial warfare. And as June approached, the growing drone above the coastline signaled that the decisive storm was already gathering beyond the horizon. The decisive moment arrived in the first days of June 1944, concealed beneath weather forecasts, coded communications, and carefully synchronized movement across thousands of kilometers. Along the French coastline, German defenders experienced only fragments of the larger picture. Increased reconnaissance flights, intensified bombing, and an atmosphere of expectation without clarity. The Atlantic Wall stood armed and occupied, yet increasingly isolated within its own defensive system. During the night of June 5 to 6, Allied air activity expanded beyond anything previously witnessed. Before dawn, waves of aircraft crossed the Channel at multiple altitudes. Pathfinders marked targets using radar-guided navigation and illumination flares, enabling following formations to bomb through cloud cover and darkness. Heavy bombers approached in massive streams, their engines merging into a continuous roar that erased natural sound along the coast. German radar operators struggled to interpret signals. Screens filled with returns too numerous to track individually. Some contacts represented bombers. Others were electronic countermeasures designed to simulate phantom fleets. Allied deception operations released metallic strips, later known as window, confusing radar detection and masking real formations within artificial echoes. Communication centers attempted coordination, but reports contradicted one another faster than they could be verified. Then the bombing began in full force. Thousands of tons of explosives fell across coastal sectors targeted for invasion. Artillery batteries at Normandy, command posts, ammunition depots, and defensive strongpoints absorbed sustained bombardment lasting hours. The objective was not perfect accuracy. It was systemic disruption. Shockwaves rolled across beaches, collapsing trenches and burying equipment beneath sand and debris. Observation posts lost visibility as smoke and dust consumed entire sectors. Inside bunkers, soldiers experienced bombardment as pressure rather than sound, a physical force compressing air and shaking reinforced walls. Electric lighting failed intermittently. Maps fell from walls. Telephone lines went silent one by one. Even when structures survived direct impact, crews found themselves cut off from neighboring units, unsure whether adjacent positions remained operational. Some artillery guns continued firing blindly toward the sea, operating on pre-planned coordinates without updated observation data. Others fell silent after nearby explosions damaged ammunition supplies or jammed mechanical systems. Reports written afterward revealed widespread confusion. Commanders could not determine whether bombardment signaled invasion or diversion. Simultaneously, Allied fighter bombers swept low over transportation routes, attacking vehicles, bridges, and communication hubs. Any attempt to move reserves toward threatened sectors encountered immediate aerial attack. Columns dispersed or halted entirely, leaving frontline units increasingly dependent on their own limited resources. The scale of air power transformed perception. German soldiers accustomed to defending fixed positions realized that survival no longer depended solely on bunker strength. The surrounding battlefield, roads, fields, villages, had been reshaped into fragmented terrain difficult to navigate or reinforce. Defensive systems designed to function collectively now operated as isolated pockets. As dawn approached on June 6, bombing gradually shifted inland, targeting reinforcement routes rather than coastal positions alone. The temporary silence that followed felt unnatural. Smoke drifted across beaches, obscuring landmarks used for range calculations. Craters filled with seawater as tides advanced. Communication attempts produced static or silence. Then came a new sound layered beneath fading echoes of explosions, naval artillery from Allied fleets approaching offshore, followed by the distant movement of landing craft. For many defenders, realization arrived slowly. The bombing had not been the battle itself but preparation for something larger already underway. The Atlantic Wall had been struck not to annihilate every bunker but to fracture coordination at the precise moment invasion began. Units that might have mounted unified resistance found themselves disoriented, partially blinded, and uncertain of orders. Some positions remained intact yet isolated. Others suffered heavy damage without understanding the broader situation. German after-action reports later acknowledged the effectiveness of the bombardment despite its imperfect accuracy. Many heavy guns survived structurally, but command networks and observation capabilities had been severely disrupted. Without communication, firepower lost coherence. Defense became localized rather than coordinated. The psychological shock proved equally decisive. Soldiers expecting an invasion led by ships first had endured hours of overwhelming aerial assault before seeing a single landing craft. The sequence reversed traditional expectations of warfare. By the time Allied forces approached the beaches, defenders were already exhausted, disoriented, and operating under degraded command structures. Above all, one memory appeared repeatedly in testimonies: the sound. Survivors described the engines as endless, arriving in waves without visible beginning or end. Even after bombers departed, the echo lingered, merging with naval gunfire and the approaching invasion fleet, a continuous mechanical presence symbolizing an enemy defined by scale rather than proximity. In that moment, the Atlantic Wall ceased to function as an integrated defensive barrier. It remained physically present, its concrete structures still standing across miles of coastline, but its strategic purpose had been broken. The decisive blow had come not through direct assault alone, but through the systematic dismantling of coordination, mobility, and certainty. And as Allied troops moved toward the beaches below smoke-filled skies, the consequences of that shattered defense began unfolding immediately, reshaping the battle not only for that day, but for the entire course of the war in Western Europe. When the bombing subsided and the invasion unfolded along the Normandy coastline, the true consequences of the aerial assault revealed themselves not in isolated explosions, but in absence, missing communication, delayed orders, and reinforcements that never arrived on time. The Atlantic Wall had not vanished. Many bunkers still stood, their guns intact, their crews alive. Yet the system connecting them had fractured at the exact moment unity mattered most. German commanders struggled immediately to understand the scale of events. Reports arriving at headquarters were incomplete and often contradictory. Telephone lines severed during bombardment forced reliance on radio transmissions vulnerable to interference and confusion. Some units reported heavy landings. Others believed attacks were diversions. Without reliable reconnaissance aircraft, increasingly unable to operate under Allied air superiority, higher command lacked a clear operational picture during the invasion's critical early hours. The bombing campaign's most decisive effect emerged in transportation paralysis. Rail lines linking Normandy to inland reserves had suffered weeks of sustained attack before June 6. Bridges destroyed or damaged forced rerouting through secondary roads already congested with military traffic. As armored divisions attempted movement toward the coast, Allied fighter bombers patrolled relentlessly overhead, striking columns whenever daylight exposed them. German operational records later confirmed severe delays. Units expected to reach defensive sectors within hours required entire days to advance short distances. Vehicles hid beneath trees, waited for darkness, or dispersed entirely to avoid detection. Fuel shortages compounded the problem, as damaged depots reduced supply efficiency. The result was fragmentation. Reinforcements arrived piecemeal rather than as coordinated counterattacks. On the beaches themselves, the impact varied by sector. Some artillery batteries continued firing effectively despite bombardment, inflicting casualties on landing forces. At Omaha Beach, for example, surviving defensive positions created intense resistance during the initial assault. Yet even there, the broader defensive network failed to function cohesively. Observation posts destroyed or blinded by bombing struggled to direct accurate fire once smoke and dust obscured visibility. Allied planners had anticipated imperfect destruction. Post-invasion analysis revealed that many bombs missed intended targets due to altitude, weather, and navigation challenges. However, strategic success depended less on precise demolition than on disruption. Bombing forced defenders underground, severed communications, and degraded coordination long enough for landing forces to establish footholds. German soldiers increasingly fought isolated battles rather than unified defense. Individual strongpoints resisted fiercely, but without synchronized artillery or timely reinforcement, localized success could not reverse the broader situation. The Atlantic Wall had been designed as an interconnected system. Once broken into fragments, its strength diminished dramatically. Psychological effects intensified throughout the day. Survivors described exhaustion following hours spent under bombardment before combat even began. Decision-making slowed as commanders operated with incomplete information. Some units hesitated awaiting orders that never arrived. Others acted independently, unaware of neighboring position status. The cumulative effect produced uneven resistance rather than coordinated defense envisioned during construction of the fortifications. Allied air superiority continued shaping events after landings commenced. Transport aircraft delivered paratroopers behind German lines, further complicating defensive response. Supply drops reinforced advancing Allied troops while German resupply remained uncertain. Aircraft circled continuously, attacking artillery positions revealed through movement or gunfire flashes. By evening on June 6, the scale of disruption became undeniable. Allied forces had secured multiple beachheads despite heavy casualties. German counterattacks, though determined in places, lacked the concentration required to push invasion forces back into the sea. The failure did not stem solely from battlefield bravery or weakness but from systemic imbalance created before the first landing craft arrived. German situation reports acknowledged that Allied air power prevented effective maneuver. Commanders noted that daylight movement had become nearly impossible. The battlefield extended far beyond beaches into roads, railways, and communication networks already shaped by weeks of bombing. War had expanded vertically. Control of the sky determined outcomes on land. The recurring sound of aircraft engines remained constant throughout the aftermath. For defenders, it signaled continued vulnerability. For advancing Allied forces, it represented protection and reinforcement. The same sound carried opposite meanings depending on perspective. Fear for some, reassurance for others. As night fell over Normandy, fires burned across damaged defenses and shattered villages. The Atlantic Wall still existed physically along much of the coastline, but its strategic promise had ended. What remained was a series of isolated fortifications facing an enemy now firmly established on European soil. And in the days that followed, the longer-term consequences of that shattered defense would reshape German strategy entirely, forcing recognition that the balance of war in the West had shifted beyond recovery. In the weeks following the Normandy landings, the consequences of the bombing campaign extended far beyond the beaches themselves. What German commanders initially interpreted as a temporary breach soon revealed itself as a structural collapse of defensive strategy in Western Europe. The Atlantic Wall, once promoted as an unbreakable shield, became evidence that static fortifications could not survive against sustained air superiority combined with industrial-scale warfare. German high command attempted rapid reassessment. Reinforcements continued moving toward Normandy, but each movement exposed a fundamental reality. Allied aircraft controlled daylight across northern France. Armored columns advancing toward the front suffered repeated attacks from fighter bombers operating with near impunity. Bridges destroyed during pre-invasion bombing limited maneuver options, forcing predictable routes easily targeted from the air. Operational reports from June and July 1944 repeatedly emphasized the same constraint: mobility had collapsed. Even elite panzer divisions required days to reposition, arriving fragmented and exhausted. Fuel shortages intensified as synthetic fuel facilities inside Germany endured ongoing strategic bombing. Vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel became increasingly common sights along rural roads. The Atlantic Wall's failure altered German strategic thinking almost immediately. Fortifications alone could no longer guarantee defense. The assumption that concrete and artillery could compensate for numerical or industrial inferiority proved outdated. Warfare had shifted toward integration. Air power, logistics, intelligence, and mobility functioning together rather than independently. Field Marshal Rommel's earlier warnings gained tragic confirmation. He had argued that the invasion must be defeated at the shoreline because Allied air power would prevent organized counterattack afterward. Events unfolded precisely as he feared. Once Allied forces secured beachheads, German attempts to concentrate strength faced constant aerial disruption. The decisive moment had passed during the hours when bombing shattered coordination. For soldiers along other sections of the Atlantic Wall, from the Netherlands to the Bay of Biscay, morale changed noticeably. Reports described growing awareness that fortifications offered limited protection against modern warfare. Units stationed far from Normandy watched bombers pass overhead daily, understanding that similar assaults could occur anywhere along the coast. Allied intelligence assessments conducted after the invasion confirmed the effectiveness of pre-landing bombing despite imperfections. Analysts noted that many bunkers remained structurally intact but operationally degraded. Communications damage, cratered terrain, and psychological exhaustion proved as decisive as physical destruction. Warfare had evolved into disruption rather than annihilation. The broader strategic consequence emerged through momentum. With Normandy secured, Allied forces established ports, airfields, and supply routes directly on continental Europe. American logistical capacity expanded rapidly. Within weeks, thousands of tons of supplies crossed the Channel daily, reinforcing advancing armies. The same industrial abundance that produced endless bomber formations now sustained ground offensives pushing inland. German forces, meanwhile, fought increasingly defensive battles under deteriorating conditions. Air attacks targeted retreating units, rail networks, and command centers. Attempts to stabilize fronts faced constant interruption. The imbalance between production capacities became unmistakable. Lost equipment could not be replaced quickly enough, while Allied material continued arriving in overwhelming quantities. Historical records from German officers reflected reluctant recognition of this transformation. Several post-war analyses concluded that Allied control of the air made traditional defensive doctrine obsolete. Even strong positions became temporary once isolated from reinforcement and supply. The battlefield extended beyond immediate engagement zones into infrastructure and industry thousands of kilometers away. The symbolic meaning of the bombing campaign grew clearer with time. The drone of Allied bombers represented more than tactical assault. It embodied an economic system capable of sustaining prolonged pressure without exhaustion. Each formation overhead reminded defenders that they faced not only an army but an entire industrial society mobilized for war. By late summer 1944, Allied forces broke out from Normandy, advancing rapidly across France. Cities once fortified against invasion were liberated in succession. German troops retreated toward their own borders, often under constant aerial attack. The Atlantic Wall, built over years with immense labor and resources, no longer shaped the war's outcome. Its strategic relevance ended within days of the invasion it was meant to prevent. Historians later observed that the wall failed not because its soldiers lacked resolve or its engineers lacked skill, but because the nature of warfare had changed faster than doctrine adapted. Static defense confronted dynamic industrial warfare, and industrial warfare prevailed. Yet beyond strategy and statistics remained a deeper transformation experienced by those who lived through it. Soldiers who once believed concrete could guarantee security had witnessed the dominance of mobility, coordination, and production. The war's outcome increasingly reflected systems rather than single battles. And as the front moved eastward toward Germany itself, the sound that once rolled across French beaches followed the retreating armies. A constant reminder that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly, carrying with it a broader lesson about modern war and the forces capable of shaping history itself. The Atlantic coast, once silent beneath the moonlight, had become a theater of transformation. Concrete bunkers and steel guns remained, silent witnesses to the fury they had endured, but the war had already moved beyond them. The drone of bomber engines, endless, mechanical, and inexhaustible, came to symbolize something larger than bombs or tactics. It represented the industrial might, coordination, and persistence of a society fully mobilized for survival and liberation. For the German soldiers who survived those days, the experience was a lesson in the limits of certainty. They had trained for naval invasion, studied maps, and manned fortifications designed to resist destruction. Yet the reality of sustained aerial bombardment reshaped perception. Safety was never absolute, and even the strongest defenses could be rendered impotent by adaptation, scale, and persistence. American bombers, producing relentless pressure, carried more than explosives. They carried a philosophy. The combination of industrial capacity and disciplined strategy created a force where abundance itself became a weapon. Each engine's roar, each payload delivered, illustrated a principle that modern warfare is not only fought with courage but with resources, organization, and the ability to sustain pressure until resistance falters. The Atlantic Wall's failure also reflected a broader truth about freedom and ideology. Nations built on flexibility, productivity, and collective purpose could project power in ways that static systems could not contain. Concrete could resist shells, but it could not withstand the coordinated force of a society willing to risk everything for a principle larger than itself. And yet, amid destruction and chaos, there remained human endurance. Defenders adapted, improvised, and survived, even as their assumptions shattered. The courage displayed on both sides underscored the intimate human cost embedded within strategic calculations, a reminder that history is shaped as much by experience as by planning. In the end, the Atlantic Wall did not vanish physically. Its remnants persisted along cliffs and beaches, enduring testimony to engineering skill and human labor. But its symbolic purpose had been irrevocably transformed. The roar of engines overhead, the shock of bombardment, and the relentless advance of forces beneath smoke-filled skies became emblematic not only of military supremacy, but of the profound consequences of industrial abundance, technological innovation, and strategic foresight. The coastline, once fortified as an impenetrable barrier, now stood as a canvas illustrating a central lesson of the war. In modern conflict, survival depends as much on adaptation, coordination, and resourcefulness as it does on stone, steel, or valor. And from the perspective of history, the story of those days reveals a deeper truth. that the might of a nation can be measured not only by what it destroys, but by what it sustains, endures, and ultimately liberates.